Hello, listeners. My name is Mohit Sodhi. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada, and I just finished my master's thesis in neuro-ophthalmology at the University of British Columbia.
And hi everyone, my name is Mohammad Asadi Lari. I'm currently living in Toronto. I spent the previous 5 years in Vancouver, but I grew up in the UK and spent my teens in Iran before moving to Canada. So I'm a bit of from everywhere. I'm currently an MD PhD student at the University of Toronto and in my first year. And I did my undergrad in physiology at UBC, and that's where I had the pleasure of meeting Mohit. Me and Mohit actually met a year and a couple months ago. It was January 2018, and it was at a reception for UBC Student Leadership Conference, and Mohit won the primary award that's there, the Nestor Krasinski Award, and I won the Faces of Today Award, one of the recipients of that award, and that's where we met for the first time. And in fact, I don't know if I mentioned this to you earlier, Mohit, but I saw you, but I wasn't sure that it was you until you were taking pictures with Mr. Nestor Kaczynski, who the award was named after, and I Googled your profile. I was like, oh, it's him. Oh, it's that guy. I just met him. So Mohit, do you want to explain to everyone, like, how you ended up getting that award and being recognized by a big university like UBC in that way?
Yeah, for sure. So I was nominated to receive the Nestor Kaczynski Award. And it was mostly based off of my leadership capabilities with a charity that I started in Vancouver, BC, called the YNOTFORTOTS Society. And what the YNOTFORTOTS Society does is that we help out a lot of underfunded schools in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia. There are a lot of schools that actually don't get enough funding to buy some of the fun activities that occur in schools, and some that we may take for granted, like things like sporting goods, or things for community kitchens, or even basic necessities like lice treatment kits for some of the students, or even science textbooks. We're both scientists here, so we both know the value of what science textbooks or microscopes mean.
Absolutely.
And I think I guess UBC really liked what we did at YNOTFORTOTS, so I guess they wanted to recognize that, and I'm really appreciative of that opportunity. Yeah.
And well, I mean, I'd been following what you'd done, and I'd actually heard of Why Not for Taught before meeting you, and I knew about the organization. I was always interested to see, okay, you're really good branding and marketing, and I saw some of my friends getting involved, and for that moment when I realized, oh, it's Mohit, the person who founded this organization, it was such an interesting moment for me, just as a side point, and really credit to the work that you did. I think that being able to get involved on that level and making impact within one's community while being a student is no small thing. Like, running an organization is on a completely volunteer basis, so kudos to you for that. And I have a somewhat similar experience when I was in first year of my undergraduate degree. It was about four something years ago. I connected with a teacher who was in Toronto, and I was in Vancouver at the time, and the teacher's name was Dr Sacha Noukhovich, and he was a very interesting guy who had a lot of really cool ideas, a lot of experience teaching, and we connected via LinkedIn, of all places, and we ended up basically building an organization called STEM Fellowship, which is a federal nonprofit. And the focus we had, like similar to how Mohit, you had a frustration with, seeing lack of resources, we saw a lack of opportunities within schools, within areas that we think were important. Like in particular, we were thinking about how there was this emphasis on coding, but not towards what the coding should be utilized for. So we then this was really Sasha's intellectual thought that really went into building what we have currently today in STEM Fellowship, called the Big Data Challenge, which is essentially using that coding towards social impact. So getting high school students to learn coding, but then to solve a problem, whether it be like in climate change, so analyzing temperature data, climate data, and then trying to derive policy solutions or entrepreneurial solutions out of that. And then what did we do? We got them to present in front of policymakers, in front of members of parliament, ministers, chief executives from banks and other corporations to see the incredible potential that students from high school had. This was one of our activities, but I think that the idea was that we built a national network out of this, presence in almost every Canadian province and a couple of international partners. And all of this started out of an undergrad student reaching out to a teacher and basically building an organization that way. And I think one of the things that we were kind of discussing earlier was we were working in different areas, and STEM Fellowships actually is grateful that Mohit is actually involved in really advising and running some of our programs today. Like his incredible experiences on board within STEM Fellowship and the experience he has from YNOTFORTOTS. I'd love for you to elaborate on this, Mohit. Like we have we've had, in many ways we had similar paths, but we've worked on different areas. And YNOTFORTOTS being active in trying to provide resources for schools on a local level, but having a very strong presence in BC. STEM Fellowship being more national, focusing on opportunities, focusing on different set of areas, two very different organizations. But the journeys that we had were very similar. So can you share how you shared with me a bit earlier about what got you to think of this, and at what point did you started to think about taking action?
Well, I definitely think that with YNOTFORTOTS, we do a lot of great work. We help a lot of schools here locally, but I definitely think that we also started our Super U Days. So some of our listeners, you might know about Super U Days, how we go into schools and provide workshops for science, for healthy living, for art, for self-esteem, and a lot of those kind of things. But one thing that I really wanted to do was get more involved. Like I mentioned before, we're both scientists. Was really help a lot of high school students, not just elementary school students, but high school students and undergraduate students get great opportunities, not just to publish their research, which we do in the STEM Fellowship Journal, but just to be exposed to science from a young age, and we can hope to really inspire a lot of students with getting into science. And I think that STEM Fellowship, one reason why I was really interested in joining STEM Fellowship, I'm now the Science Communication Director, is because we have our own journal called the STEM Fellowship Journal. Mohammad, do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, yeah, sure. And the STEM Fellowship Journal essentially started, was one of our core programs alongside the Big Data Challenge that I mentioned earlier. It was a chance for high school and undergraduate students to publish in a journal, in a peer-reviewed journal associated with Canadian Science Publishing, which is Canada's national scientific publisher. And so essentially the STEM Fellowship Journal is a sister journal with a couple of other major Canadian journals like the Canadian Genetics Journal, the Canadian Physics Journal, and a couple of other major Canadian societies journals. And so basically we were elevating the research and innovation coming from high school and undergraduate students to that level. And essentially what all of the organizations STEM Fellowship is about is we're a collective of 350 high school volunteers. So these are people who are working for us on the ground, or undergraduate volunteers or graduate volunteers from all across the country, and essentially elevating the level of the conversation that we have with respect to STEM education, science, technology, engineering, math, in case we didn't mention this earlier, and elevating that to people of influence, and policymakers, people in making decisions in the academic realm and universities, educators rather, and corporations who want to invest and are looking to develop the talent pipeline. And I think none of this would have been possible if, and I think this is really true for YNOTFORTOTS and STEM Fellowship, if we weren't able to effectively motivate and mobilize our peers. And so I guess a question that I have for you, Mohit, is how did you, so you had an idea, you were seeing something, the lack of resources within schools. How did you motivate your peers? And how did that, how did a snowball effect start happening for you?
Well, I definitely think that within Why Not for Tots, and I'm sure well, I know now too with STEM Fellowship, is that it's really important to value the volunteers and to really be that leader and instill these philanthropic values or within the volunteers. And I think that one of the main things that we had to do was really make the volunteers feel valued, because we wouldn't be anywhere without our volunteers. And I think that instilling that philanthropic I'm saying values a lot, that philanthropic initiative, and to really show them where there is a lack of something and something that they can do to help fill that void. So when I started Why Not for Tots with my co-founder in fourth year, we saw that there were a lot of budget cuts towards the public school system. And we thought, well, hey, we're scientists. What's the most empirical way to address this? And it was just to go have a conversation with the principals and see where they lack funding and to fill that void. And that's something that we really like to pass on to our volunteers, is to make sure that they know that whatever they're doing is actually making a huge difference. And we like to bring our volunteers to these schools when we do our donation delivery, so that they can see that these items and their effort and everything is all culminating to something great. And when people come up to us after and say that, hey, if it weren't for these donations, we would not have been able to get these particular items. So we're very thankful. And I think that that's really, really motivating, not just for myself, but for a lot of our volunteers.
Well, I mean, it's fascinating. And I think, to share with the viewers the extent that the Why Not for Tots has made that impact within BC and the Greater Vancouver area. I've seen Mohit give interviews on Canada's national broadcaster about the work that they do, and so I just think about the level of impact that has for people who are looking. Okay, they might want to volunteer for Why Not for Tots, but they might also be thinking about, they might be a high school student, they might be an undergrad student, seeing that, okay, a peer of theirs has been able to motivate, has been able to create social change, and has been able to create positive impact with very limited resources, and starting something off and really creating a snowball effect. And I think that's the greatest thing that any of us as young leaders can aspire to, is motivating others. And what I try to share constantly, whether with our team in STEM Fellowship, and I'm no longer in the lead executive role that I was a couple of months ago, but during the 3-4 years that I was leading the organization and our student team, was everyone should be leaders within their own right. They would have their own style, they would have their own story, and they would have their own element that they bring to the table. And what I always saw as the imperative on my end was that giving them a voice, allowing them to partake in the decision-making process, and allow them to make the process more efficient and more and richer by providing their insight. And when I think back, this has also been the case that I've seen in any successful, especially youth-run organization, but really any organization, is like an organization that allows different individuals with their different perspectives to share their story, ends up making better decisions, ends up being more sustainable, and ends up growing bigger and better. To add to that, I feel STEM Fellowship has given me the opportunity to be involved in other youth-led organizations and work with other youth collectives, including the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, including the World Economic Forum Global Shapers community. And also partake in Canada's the development of Canada's youth strategy, or first youth strategy in this country. And what I've seen there is that I'm always in awe of people like you, Mohit, people that I see in various fields really changing the status quo, and more importantly, listening to their stories and listening to what motivated them, what made them take action. Sometimes it's a moment, sometimes it's a build-up, then a moment that sparks. And I'm wondering, for you, throughout your high school and university, what was the build-up that you saw, and what was the spark?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think that just going through university, I was lucky enough to have a lot of great opportunities growing up. And just seeing that, not everyone is lucky enough to have the same opportunities that I did, and I really wanted to make sure that we should really be, we should really let students reach their full potential. And I feel like right now, because of material goods, even very, very simple things, they're not able to reach that full potential. And I think that that's something else that is really similar between Why Not for Tots and STEM Fellowship, is that we really try to give students a lot of different types of opportunities. So for example, Mohammad and I, we're both very lucky enough to have been published quite a bit in reputable academic journals. And Mohammad, why don't you talk a little bit about STEM Fellowship Journal and its overall impact that it's had for many students across the country?
I think the STEM Fellowship Journal is part of a bigger story, and that is including younger voices in the collective science and innovation dialogue that happens within a country. A lot of countries right now, including Canada, are thinking about how they fundamentally change their economies, how they think about what they call the innovation economy, and embracing it and preparing young people, preparing the people who are going to be entering the workforce for the needs of that economy. And in many senses, I think there's a lot of agreement that our current school systems don't work as they should, and they're not necessarily serving that purpose. Many elements of the school system haven't changed in years, and I think my co-founder of STEM Fellowship, Sacha Noukhovich, he really brings this up effectively. He's like, the schools are still run the ways that militaries are run, and when we want to deal with issues like the gender inequalities in STEM that we see in a lot of countries, in particular within Western countries, like this is actually, believe it or not in Iran, it's quite reverse. It's a different ratio favoring women in STEM areas. But overall, we see that gender inequality and the lack of opportunities, and we see the rural-urban inequality and many other inequalities. A big part of it actually stems from the fact that we haven't changed fundamentally how our education system works. It's still run in a militaristic way, in a way that even the disciplines, the chemistry, physics, and biology that we still teach in schools, well, that doesn't really apply as much to the new needs of the workforce, the way that it's being taught. So if we think about the fundamental way that our system hasn't changed, we see some of these cracks, and they're major cracks. And the whole raison d'etre of STEM Fellowship was, let's see what young people can do to create opportunities for their peers and try to change the status quo. And hopefully by creating these opportunities, people of influence will start seeing what could be done. And hopefully we'll follow this example. We've already seen that start to happen, but we're only 4.5 years old, so it's a very long way left. And there are people who are continuing to work within STEM Fellowship in that regard. And I think the journal is part of that story. And really tying it back to what you said earlier, Mohit, I'd been involved, and I was lucky to have opportunities from my high school back in Iran to work in a chemistry lab, really fall in love with the process that research works. But I know that isn't possible for a lot of people. And the key question is, how do we try to democratize science? How do we try to democratize educational opportunities? How do we democratize it for genders, for economic backgrounds, for urban and rural? And I've found that there is a particular impact that grassroots organizations like STEM Fellowship can have in that regard, because they will bring a completely different perspective, and they will bring a perspective of people who have not accepted the status quo as it is. So people who don't accept the current structures because they are going through it and they haven't yet gone through that habituation that previous generations may have gone through. And that's the real power in the work that we do. And I think when we think about broader impact, the work that you've done in Vancouver through Why Not for Tots, again, not accepting the status quo, when we're thinking about problems like climate change and how do we effectively deal with them, you see that young leader, I forgot her name, the 15-year-old from Sweden. Again, she is refusing to accept the status quo. I think Malala Yousafzai refused to accept the status quo. We can argue about, how effective everyone's work is or what area they've been working on. I don't want to go into that. But the key point I want to make is, within the big problems that we have in the society, young people have a particular place to play a leading role. And a lot of politicians want to pamper to that. And I think the point we really want to make out of this podcast is, it doesn't matter what area you are working in. It really matters that if you don't think what's happening right now is right, you have the power to act upon it. And to act upon it, you need to motivate your peers. You need to be able to build a coalition. You need to be able to build a coalition of people who share your goal but are also different from you, because they need to bring different perspectives. And I'm curious, Mohit, how did you do that within Why Not for Tots? Like, how did you try to bring in people who were from different backgrounds, and how did you feel like that helped in making the organization more resilient and stronger and more effective?
Well, I think that in terms of bringing people together, I think that the best way to do that is to highlight a problem, like we talked about earlier, and get people together who share that common goal with you, and who, like you said, don't accept the status quo. They see something that they don't like, and they go out and they go do their best to try to change that. And I think that what we both hope to do is to inspire and to show that you don't have to be like a big time celebrity. You don't have to be Justin Bieber, becoming famous at like such a young age. You can be a student, and you can go out and you can make a big difference, whether it's locally or whether it's nationally, and hopefully at some point internationally. And I think that what a lot of people, nowadays, especially with politics and things like that, being so, I guess, whether you want to call it backwards or whether you want to call it polarizing or whatever, I think that one thing that people really have to do is to not accept the status quo. Yeah. And you really have to just think for yourself. Whenever someone wants to talk about politics with me, whenever someone wants to talk about whether it's science or whatever, I think the most important thing that you have to do is just think for yourself. You don't have to take whatever you see on the internet, or whatever you see on TV, or even this podcast, for example. You don't have to take everything that we say, to be 100% true.
Absolutely, yeah.
We want you to think for yourself. So whether you want to believe in whatever politician is leading your country, or whether you want to believe in the big problems that are occurring today, even things like, things that are very controversial, like, I don't know why it is, but climate change or anti-vaxxers or things like that. We want you to think for yourself. We want you to take things that, we want you to take the evidence and come up with an opinion and a well-structured argument for yourself. And I think, Mohammed, coming to that conversation, I think, what do you think is the biggest, problem that you think society faces today?
Such an easy question. You should have given me a hard one. One point I'd make before attempting, and I want to give myself more time to think about it, you brought up the anti-vaxxer movement and the anti-vaccine movement in general. It's funny because, again, we both have a science background and we're both aspiring clinicians. And given that we want to work in those fields, and both we care about patients, and we also care about the science behind what patients receive. I think the anti-vaxxer example is a prime example of bad science leading to bad clinical outcomes and public health disasters. And I think it's the exact sort of thing that when young people become active in, if we have effective youth mobilization around it, for example, within the US or even within Canada or around the world, actually, there are other countries, but I think it's a bigger issue apparently here from what the stats show, is if they create a movement and go within their schools and talk to parents, they can actually make change. They can. Many parents would be forced to listen to their children. They might not listen to the scientists. They might call it the elite or whatever, or they might not accept the arguments. But if the younger generation, if the children who are in the schools, I don't want to call them the children. I want to call them the younger generation. Within different generations, again, youth is also a blanket term. If they mobilize, they can make change on this issue, and I think it's just an example. I really think the biggest issue, and I didn't see this as the way I did, and I'm grateful to the people that I worked with for different organizations, including the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and the Global Shapers and other platforms that I've had the privilege of talking to leaders in areas outside of my areas of work, science, health, and I guess like education, people who are very active climate advocates. And I really think more and more about the how important the effects of climate change, how profound it will be for our generation, and for generations after us. The people are already bearing the brunt. We will have to bear more of the brunt, and the people after us will have to take even more. And I think that's why it's so imperative for us, for us young people, really everyone, but I think in particular people who will be seeing more of the consequences, to take action, and it starts from taking action within their households, changing minds in communities, changing minds at home, and changing the minds of politicians and within corporations. And this includes what people buy, how people behave at home. If you choose what you buy more effectively, you can send a message to corporations, and that's a whole social movement by itself, to making corporations go green, getting governments to change their policies. And people who are listening, you might be from really anywhere around the world. It's hard not to see the effects that climate change has, and it is really, the more you think about it, it is pretty grim. So I think that's one issue where young people can really take action on, and I really want to emphasize, it's important to think global, think about the global impact something has. Again, this is something that I sometimes criticize myself for. I'm overambitious. I want to think, okay, what can we do on a national level? What can we do on an international level? How can we make broad change? How can we collaborate between countries? But while it's important to think global, it's much more important to think what you could do locally, because it's those locals that connect to become global. And what I really admire about what you've done at Why Not for Tots, you created a local movement, and that can be amplified. That can inspire other Why Not for Tots. If other communities apply the same, and there are certainly other organizations that are doing good within other communities, that is how social movements happen. So stop, I guess, assuming that the first step would be changing the world. It's about changing local behaviors within yourself, within your peers, emphasize peers, within your community, and that will amplify. And it could be within climate change, within the anti-vax movement, within really poverty reduction, homelessness, opioid reduction, or addiction rather, and reducing opioid addiction. These are all issues, and I think these all have local dimensions, and they are global phenomena at the same time. And I think that if we want to truly advance the human story forward, we have to think about how social media has connected people around the world, but at the same time, we should not forget about what happens within our homes, within our neighborhoods, within our schools, within our communities, and how that is part of the global collective. And that is something that I think we should all go away with thinking about. And so I want to pass this to you, Mohit, to really have the final word on this. You created a local movement. We're fortunate to have you in STEM Fellowship, and your incredible leadership in STEM Fellowship too. How do you see, a lot of these movements going forward? What are challenges that we've seen, and how can, what should people at home keep in mind when addressing these issues?
Well, I will get to your question.
Yeah.
But I think one thing, just to reiterate what you were saying earlier, just about the biggest challenges to our generation and to the world going forward, and to moving the human story forward. There's a very particular reason why I brought up things like climate change and anti-vaxxers. I think it's very, very important, like you mentioned, is for the youth, or like you said, the younger generation, to really, really, really criticize everything that they see. Yeah. You cannot believe everything that you see, especially when it comes to celebrity endorsements. It drives me absolutely bonkers when I see celebrities nowadays endorsing things that are not in the least backed by science. And I think that it's really important, what Why Not for Tots, and especially what STEM Fellowship does, in trying to educate, younger people to think on their own, to really look at something,
critically appraise.
Exactly.
Even science is coming out. It's like, if it's a scientist saying something, sir, you're saying.
No, for sure. And I think that, like, for example, my supervisor and I, Dr. Meyer at Minan, we were starting a platform. Actually, it's called Unravel Medicine. If you look it up, you won't find it yet. We're still in the planning stages, but it's where we critically analyze big big data research, and we find the biases, and we try to see how relevant that is on a public policy level, and perhaps it might be able to help guide clinicians' prescribing patterns and things like that. And one thing that drives us both nuts is when we see news articles and things like that coming out saying that drug A causes disease B or whatever, and people blow things really far out of proportion. Yeah. And then when you look at the original study, you find that it should be taken with a grain of salt. Yeah. So I think really getting students to think critically, and like you said, critically appraise what they see. I think that's probably super important. Yeah. Actually, not probably, that is 100% super important into making sure that we don't have a grim future. Yeah. Because the younger generation, the people born after 2000, this really dating us, isn't it? Yeah. But I think really making sure that they understand how to move the human story forward, and the way to do that is to make sure you think for yourself, gather evidence, and make a well-educated claim or argument with whatever it may be that you want to do. And that's not just in science, that's in anything. Yeah, what I loved about your answer, apart from how insightful it was, that you said you were going to answer my question later, but you actually answered it. I think you really touched you really touched on the key point about critical appraisal, and because I think there's always this unfortunate misunderstanding. Okay, younger generation can't think well, or they're on social media. They're not really thinking about global issues. So I think sometimes we have to work harder to really sometimes prove arguments and advance them. And I think the key thing that we try to do at Stanford Fellowship with the Big Data Challenge in particular, and with the journal and disseminating the material, is data-driven conversations where those are really used to make an argument and make a critical argument, and that argument will hopefully be applied towards social good. So I think that's how we're hoping what you'll take away from this conversation on advancing the human story. We want to thank Andrea for providing us the opportunity to share our stories, and we're hoping that there are also our contact information. Email will be shared in case you were interested in contacting us and getting in touch if you were interested in the work that we're doing. So Mohit, it was great. It was great. Great chatting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Mohit's visiting from Vancouver, and we're both sitting in Toronto, in downtown Toronto, near the university. And we want to say goodbye to you from here. Take care. Have a wonderful morning, day, evening, wherever you are.
Yeah, thank you for listening.